Hello, everyone. Welcome to the September 12th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development at MakerDAO. Today, we are going to talk about governance. We are going to talk about risk, and we are going to continue what I believe is going to be a new trend, talking about oracles. As the governance ecosystem becomes more and more complicated, or sophisticated, maybe I should say, we are going to be bringing new actors into the system that are empowered by the community to do things on behalf of the community. Hopefully in some near-term but glorious future, we will begin to engage with community members who are acting on behalf of the community as well, post-MCD. But in order to get there, we have a lot of work to do, and that's the work we're doing in these calls. So today, we have governance, we have oracles, and we have risk. In the governance, oh, sorry, I forgot my preambles again. I am going to continue to beg and grovel. If people have questions, please feel free to ask those questions at any moment. So type them in the chat. If you don't have access to a microphone, if you do have access to a microphone, please interrupt us. We love it when that happens. And just ask away. We will deal with questions as they arise. If you want to formulate your questions and ask later, at the top of the hour, at the end of the hour, so we'll have just a general Q&A session. So we'll stick around for 30 minutes and talk about anything that people might have on their minds. I think that's enough for the preambles today. I'm going to try and keep this as tight as I possibly can. So in the governance world, we have a couple of interesting things happen. Good news and more good news, I guess. The good news being that the community chose overwhelmingly not to fire Cyrus and Rich from the governance ecosystem. That was nice to hear. So we still have public jobs. So the governance facilitator role was ratified with a 99.9% approval rating. I'm still daily appreciating whoever it was that bought $20 in Maker to vote no against me. I love you. I want to send you a t-shirt if you're willing to send me your address. Cyrus, on the other hand, was 100% approval, because I guess he's like 0.5% more approachable than I am, I suppose. The good news there, though, is that we can begin to start doing some work in earnest. Yeah, I believe it was Cyrus that voted no. I actually planned to buy $21 in Maker and vote no against Cyrus just to make my stats look better, but I forgot. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do, and so we are going to start doing that work. And part of that work is evidenced by the activity in the forums recently. And I'm going to let I'm not going to steal his thunder. LongForWisdom can tell us a bit about some of that. But we've had these slow burn issues for a while now around cadence of the votes for the stability fees. The questions around, do we really need to be doing this every single week? The community has gotten together and debated that issue and come to some conclusions, and we'll be hearing about that soon. The same process has occurred around the rate stepping. So when we have these stability fee votes, we have basically, I'll come out and say it, arbitrary number of options in these votes. We chose previously just to pick 4 above and 4 below the current stability fee, and that's what people can vote on. Why? Sounds good. It turns out that there's more sophisticated and elegant ways of doing that, and the community has been talking about exponential rate stepping, and so we'll dig into that a bit. Other news on the governance front, particularly around stability fees, is that, interestingly enough, and this is something I find particularly heartening, is that the community, heartening not because I fully endorse it, because I think that this is a beneficial activity. So I need to walk this fine line. The community keeps on lowering the stability fee, which is good. That's a very good thing, because it shows the ecosystem that the maker holders, the voters, are not, self-interest to the point of self-destruction. They're not going to raise the stability fee endlessly in some hopes of burning all the maker in existence. They will actually lower the stability fee when it's appropriate. This shows that the community and the maker holders hold the stability of DAI paramount over everything else. And that's precisely what this ecosystem, or what this governance ecosystem, is designed ultimately to do. We need to support the PEG so we can support the protocol, so the protocol can support DeFi, and DeFi can take over the world. And that's precisely what we're all about. So lots of good things happening there. The most recent stability fee poll advocates for, I just looked and I forgot already, 12.5. 91% of voters came out for, of the maker state came out for 12.5%. So that's going to be interesting to see whether that gets ratified. I think I might just wrap it up there. Governance is going to be, there's going to be a lot more to talk about in governance over the next few months, but let's not drown out the interesting things that are happening in the Oracle's world, which we'll get to in a second. Before we do that, though, I want to hand it over to you, LongForWisdom, if you can give us a recap of the cool things that are happening in the forums.
Yeah, we'll do.
Thanks.
Cool. So I'll start with the sort of active discussions we've had this week and that are sort of spinning up. So I'll just do Cyrus' thunder, but he recently posted a blog post on the DSR, which I think from the people who've read it seem to find it pretty good. So that's discussion's been kicking off over that, which is good. So in addition to that, so I made a thread specifically about the current signaling process as I see what it is currently, I guess, sort of a description of what I view it to be. So there's been some discussion around that as well. This is fairly important because it sort of interacts with how the signal requests I've been kind of pushing are going. So if you think they're going wrong in some way, then let me know in that thread.
Well, I know that in these recaps, you sort of give us just a list of the interesting things people should look at, but this is a good one, actually. Can you give us like a 1 minute or 2 minute recap of what's going on in that current signaling process there, the things that you're advocating?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, so I'm essentially suggesting that we split it up into stages. I've set 3 stages. I think it's good to start with a sort of more general sort of question of whether there is appetite for change in some form. Not sort of specifically, but sort of generally around an issue. So that lets us sort of early exit if like everyone is kind of fine with something. Like if someone's just, you know, picking up some personal bugaboo with the system, then everyone can sort of say it's fine and it can end early. So while we do that stage, you can also discuss more specific things as we're signaling for that general change. So sort of do some parallelism there to try and increase efficiency. Stage 2, so if there's appetite for change, then we move to stage 2. We create a multi-choice poll that lets everyone signal yes or no to any of the suggested specific options that have been discussed or proposed by members of the community. I suggest that lasts for 2 weeks because I think you need 2 weeks to give everyone enough time to vote on things, look at and vote on things and think about things, specific options. And on stage 3, if one of those specific proposals has the majority backing, so if over half of the people think that one of the specific proposals is good, then we can move to stage 3, which is moving the poll on chain and trying to get it ratified by the MKR token holders.
Cool. So I encourage anybody who's interested in getting involved with governance to check this out, because this is an example of emergent process that's forming in the community, which is going to be big for us. We have, there's 2 ways we can, let's divide the world up into arbitrary pieces then. So let's look at things binarily, from a binary perspective. There's 2 ways we can do this. We can either come up with a 600-page manual about how governance is going to work and attempt to predict how the future will shake out. I think that might be fraught with peril. The other option on the other end of the spectrum is let's just not figure out anything and just see what happens as we go along. And then there's a happy middle ground between those two ends, where we set targets for ourselves in the future. We know what we hope governance will be, and then we plan out how we're going to get there in increments, reasonable increments. It's always tough to predict how the future was going to look at all, ever, but more specifically with crypto, this is a very accelerated and rapidly evolving ecosystem. So the things that are happening in the forum right now are examples of how people choose to self-organize in the framework that we have to work with here. And it's important that we remain cognizant of that evolution, and that people step up and speak and have their voices heard. It's not but also these are all living documents, and it also gives us enough velocity to implement things and to do what needs to be done in order to make this protocol a success, but it also gives us enough agility to course correct. And so I'm super excited about how well things like this are turning out and the efforts of people like LongForWisdom to formalize some of the things that we've been thinking about. So please have a look at this thread. If you have any suggestions about how it can be improved or you have any comments, please add them. So, LongForWisdom, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, though, and I have to admit that I haven't had a chance to pull this apart yet, but I've been increasingly interested in scheduling, which sounds like the most boring thing a person could possibly be interested in. But there's some interesting questions to be answered here. So we have somebody comes into the forum, they make a proposal about something, or they ask an important question. How long do we talk about that question? And how do we determine that that question has been answered? And then how long do we wait for a poll vote to happen? And then how long do we wait for a governance poll to occur? These are all things that I'm really having trouble wrapping my head around, because we can't predict the level of interest that a specific issue might have. We can't predict the level of debate that it requires. We have to fit these things into larger calendars of events. We need to think about, we need to worry about overwhelming the community with too many activities at once. So is that something that you've been considering in these process talks?
Yeah, for sure. So just to go back a second for one of the things you just said, just about the whole figuring out everything ahead or figuring out as you sort of go. Just to sort of double down and say, like, the sort of description I did is descriptive rather than prescriptive, right? It's literally just my view of how I'm planning to run the next couple of late signal requests, right? So anyone can come along and do something different, or say something different, or suggest something different. In regards to scheduling, there's the second stage, stage 2, where everyone sort of discusses specific proposals. There's kind of a requirement in that step that one of those specific proposals gets a majority vote with a reasonable number of voters. So my suggestion, if that doesn't happen, then you essentially repeat that entire stage and you pay for another weeks. And you, in more time discussing the proposals, you get more proposals, compromise proposals, and then you continue with that until, if after say 3 iterations you've not reached any sort of consensus, then you sort of say, right, well, we can't agree on this, we'll drop it for X time and then come back to it in the future, possibly.
Yes, that dropping it and coming back thing, that's interesting to me as well. Do we need to, I see that there's value in creating a sense of urgency. So like the community needs to learn that if you don't check in at least once every 2 weeks, you might miss something, which I think might be a reasonable expectation for engaged stakeholders. What happens if we wanted to have a debate that's just, let's just think about this, and if people care, we'll do it at some point? Like, can we have these open-ended discussions that just last for months potentially? Or do we have to set these like 2 weeks to do this, 2 weeks to do that?
I feel like we kind of already have that in terms of just general threads that discuss things. Like, you don't have to make like a signal request thread. The signal request is more sort of when something's been discussed and sort of there's some consensus that something needs to be done, I guess, then you set that up and then try and move through the process.
Are you remaining cognizant about the cognitive overhead, I suppose, or the amount of work that we might be imposing on people? Do you feel that, have you seen any evidence that some of the stuff might be becoming too onerous, or we're in the clear there?
It's hard to judge specific evidence. Yeah. I mean, no one's been sort of coming out and saying like, this is way too much all the time. I mean, there's always a couple of people saying that, but no one that's engaged has really been saying that. Yeah, it's really hard because the more time everyone can kind of commit to it, the better decisions we can make. But obviously, that's the trade-off, right? So.
Yeah, it's the same challenge that David has. That a week can slip by very quickly and very easily, and thinking, oh man, what have I missed? And then having to spend an hour or two trying to catch up on the forums is going to be tough. But anyways, I think that these are obviously challenges we just need to address over time. The fact that we have so much activity that it takes a while to catch up is probably the best problem we could conceive.
And so the community is credit rich, actually. Every time I catch up, I'm like really pleasantly surprised by like the quality and the depth of the conversation that's happening. So yeah.
Yeah, me too. I could not be happier. And if you knew me at all, you'd know what a strange thing that is for me to say. It's uh, governance from a super high level is about the management of human risk, and we haven't bumped up to that into that risk yet, which I'm super happy about. There's a lot of smart people doing a lot of smart things in a lot of smart ways. So I'm very excited about how this thing is shaking out. All right, sorry for derailing you long for wisdom. Was there other threads you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, there's a couple more, but that's all good, don't worry. So we've also seen the first collateral onboarding request, which was from the team behind TUSD. So there's been some discussion around that, like the pros and cons. Generally, I think people are a little bit skeptical of these sorts of tokens. So we'll see sort of how that pans out. We can get some more information in that thread from them. Let's see what else. But yeah, so the actual signal request threads as well. So just to sort of reiterate what you said, the exponential rate stepping thread, I think it's probably at a point where we want to move on chain. We kind of voted, a reasonable number of people seem to have voted that they want to move on chain in a specific form. So I guess that's sort of looking at you, I guess, to sort of ask sort of how that proceeds from this point, I guess.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The plan is that once the community signals its support for something, then the wheels of bureaucracy begin to spin, and then it gets scheduled for moving into the portal itself. So one of the things I think I've cautioned in a thread somewhere, but possibly not enough or in the right spot, is that there's the overhead. There's administrative overhead with moving these things out of the forum and into the portal. And it would be nice to add some predictability to this thing. So my hope is that the community would be fine with, at some point, consensus has been established. There's some kind of ceremony or something where the poll is closed, the thread is ended, and then at that point a timer starts or something, and then the next Monday of next business week, then it goes into the forum. I mean, into the governance portal. I think it would be my plan. Have you seen anything in the forums that would that lead you to believe that people would find that objectionable?
I think that sounds good. I would say I think that we've kind of reached that kind of end of the thread point on the exponential rate stepping thread.
Yeah, and you and I have spoken about this, that you have visibility on the ground and acting sort of as an advocate for the community, or at least an administrator, an ad hoc administrator. We need to tighten up our communication a bit. So we're going to have these weekly calls of you just letting me know what's going on and reminding me what needs to be done next, which would be useful in the short term.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, cool. Anything else of interest we need to talk about?
Yeah, so the other one was the signal request around the cadence, like the 1 week versus 2 week versus potentially longer cadence. So I'd say, as I said, sort of coming back to the sort of steps, sort of stage one, general appetite for change seems to be kind of mixed. I think it's about 50-50 in terms of whether we're happy with the 1 week cadence or whether we want to change to potentially or longer.
This is something else that I'm super interested in too, is this notion that we need to have sort of I shouldn't say overwhelming, but we need to have a visible or a comfortable level of agreement in the forum before things can go to the portal. And I think that we need to keep in mind that we're potentially talking about two different demographics here. So we have in the community, in the forum, we have more of a representative democracy in the loosest, most easily civil attacked form imaginable, but this is just people talking about things. We can aggregate some numbers about them, or some data about the amount of people that show up and the amount of people that say yes. But frequently, well, I don't know, what I want the community to consider though is that even if there isn't overwhelming support in the forums, there still might be value in putting something in the portal for the maker holders at large to vote on, I suppose. As I started saying all that, that sounded like sort of, I realized it was half thought out, but it's something that I want to consider. Like, is this a filter for anything that gets into the governance portal? Does it have to have a certain level of support in the forums? It seems like that's the general consensus that the community has arrived at, but it's something to be considered, I suppose.
Yes, so I actually mentioned this, called this out specifically in the exponential thread.
Oh, do you?
In that, yeah. So there was a question. The last sort of poll in there was about what form the poll should take on chain, right? And whether to have it just as we do the consent, we vote on the consensus option, yes or no, or MKR token holders vote on the consensus option, yes or no, or do we set up like multiple polls? Do we let them vote on every option that was suggested, rather than just like the top rated one? And in general, the forum seems to think that just vote on like the top rated one in the forum. But of course, again, that's the representative democracy saying that we should listen to the representative democracy.
Yeah, that's interesting. We'll figure it out. I don't think it's an existential threat at this point. Okay, anything else on your list?
No, I think that's most of the good stuff.
All right, cool. Thanks for the recap. It's great to surface those things here. Nik, I'm going to turn this over to you now and refresh my memory or clarify whether the plan has changed. Are we going to talk about sustainability in the Oracle system, or did you want to recap some of the things that happened in the last week?
I want to go over a little bit of a recap first.
Okay.
So I think there's a little bit of a lot of carryover between who was attending the governance call last week and this week. But if you didn't, last week we talked about kind of the Oracle ecosystem within the Maker protocol, and kind of the different facets. And I put forth a bunch of different proposals for the community to consider. So I'm still on track to publish a bunch of these proposals in the forum later this week, either end of today or early tomorrow. They'll probably end up being in the governance section of the forum, and then I'll make a cross post in the new Oracle section of the forum. I also wanted to give a shout out to Mariano Conti. He is the original architect of the oracles that Maker uses in the protocol currently, and is also designed the smart contracts for Oracle's V2. So Mariano, I don't know if you want to say hi and introduce yourself, or if everybody already knows who you are.
I'll just say a couple of words. I did the easy part, which was sitting alone with my computer, programming some of the technology that goes behind it. Now you get the fun part of actually turning it into a community and expanding it to governance. So I wish you the best of luck. And I'll be helping as well with wherever I can. But excited that we're finally, like, this is what we always wanted to do, right? So we're at the steps where the oracles are going to become even more interesting. So thank you, Nik.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, man. So one of the things, I don't want to go on for too long, but one of the things I wanted to touch on, I got a few questions last week from people about why are we doing this and why now? The oracles were always meant to be handed over to governance, and it's part of this drive of gradual decentralization that the foundation has committed to, that we're starting to do this now. And in particular, the proposal that I think was the most confusing to people was the one talking about the incentives and why do we need them? Why are we doing this? So I wanted to share my screen real quick and show you guys the same diagram I showed you last week, but to expand on it a little bit more. Okay. So this diagram is showing the different actors in the Oracle ecosystem. So on the bottom left here, We have you guys who are the Maker token holders. On the top here, we have the feeds. And I think this maybe wasn't as clear last week about what a feed is, but feeds are kind of humans or organizations that are running a bot. And all this bot does is it sources the prices for an asset, and then it signs, with your identity saying, I think, feed A thinks the price of Bitcoin is this. And essentially feeds are the inputs for the Oracle smart contracts, where people will actually get the canonical Oracle price from. So here in this diagram, you can see that feeds are pushing the prices to the Oracle smart contracts. And then on the bottom here, you have kind of data consumers. So you can think of them as dApps or other smart contracts. And other smart contracts can then read the prices from the Oracle smart contracts. And they're meant to then remunerate MKR holders in some way. And so why did we set it up this way? We didn't used to regulate access on the Oracle prices to external partners. Why are we starting to do this now? I think is the biggest question that we got. So there's a couple of reasons, but the main two that I would like to focus on is decentralization and sustainability. Currently, the dev fund is paying fees for the price service that they're providing. It is the intention that eventually MKR holders will take over that responsibility through the use of stability fees. Because the Maker Foundation may not be around forever, may not have buckets of money forever. And so if you want to make a resilient Oracle system, you need to decentralize the funding of it as well. And the stability fee mechanism provides a nice way to do that. But if MKR holders are going to be spending on their money on feeds, they're going to probably want some way to then monetize that feed infrastructure, right? If they're paying the feeds and they're administrating this entire Oracle ecosystem, it only makes sense that they have the ability to monetize it as well. And so that's why we've added this whitelist to the Oracle smart contracts. And essentially the whitelist is a list of smart contract addresses that governance controls. So you guys get to decide who is allowed to read prices from the oracles and who is not. And in doing so, right, you can charge a fee for that, right? So you can go to, token company X, right? And they want to read the BTC price. And, you guys can say, okay, good. Well, that's going to cost you, 5,000 DAI annually or something like that. Or maybe you say, some amount monthly, right? There's a couple of things here though. So what this proposal does is it's not actually enforcing this particular combination of relationships between all the actors, right? So I said earlier that the Maker Development Fund is paying the fees right now. So really, this piece is not applicable to this proposal, right? I've also said last week that for business development purposes, and really for just being a good actor in the ecosystem, we shouldn't be charging anything to be on the whitelist for the first year. We have a lot, and I mean a lot of projects using our oracles. For better or worse, we don't even know the extent to how many of them there really are. And this is just by nature of us being the first to release any oracles and maintain them. So the ecosystem kind of really grew very, very quickly by just integrating our oracles into everything. And so we don't want to risk some kind of chain reaction by kind of pulling the rug out from everyone and saying, okay, now you're cut off from oracles, and nobody has a plan B, right? So even by adding this whitelist, we don't have to actually use it right away. It is another tool for MKR token holders to kind of use down the road. And another thing I wanted to bring up is that there are ways to utilize the whitelist to extract value from the Oracle ecosystem that is not monetary. So, for example, you could have some kind of quid pro quo relationship between someone who wants to do something, right, for us, but also gain access to the oracles. So let's say there's a DEX, and this DEX wants to start offering margin trading. Well, if you want to offer margin trading, you're going to need oracles, right, to know when to liquidate the positions, right, when to margin call. So what if we could have a deal with this DEX where we say, hey, you know, we'll give you the oracle services, but in exchange, you know, we want you to list DAI as a base token, you know, trading pair, right? So these are the kinds of things that are possible. So I kind of just want to get everyone's minds thinking more in that direction. And so to just really drill this point home, the acceptance of this proposal does not mean that this is what's going to happen on day one when we launch Oracle's V2, right? The Maker Development Fund will still be paying for the feeds. You know, ideally, you're not going to charge people for the first year, you know, to actually use the oracles, but it is an explicit approval that this is the model and relationship of incentives and actors that we're moving towards. So this is going to be one of the proposals that I will be posting tomorrow in the forum. So if you have any feedback or, you know, concerns, comments, or if you even have like some better ideas of how we should structure this, I am all ears. So that is it from my end.
All right, you surprised me. I was not expecting that. So if anybody in the community has any questions, you want to simmer on that for a second, either type them in the chat at the side or ask us now. We will also have, like I said earlier, the 30 minutes at the end of the hour to do a random Q&A. So, thanks for that, Nick. That was great. Cyrus, I'm going to hand it over to Risk now, if you want to take it away. Did you want to talk about the DSR today, or do you want to talk about the PEG first?
You know, I'm thinking of maybe holding off for a week on the DSR talks, because it seems like there's some good discussion kind of getting started in the forums. And I think the blog just went out yesterday or the day before. So I'm thinking kind of letting that stew for a bit and then circling back when we've heard some more thoughts. But if there are any questions, or if anybody else wants to talk about it, I'm certainly open to as well.
I guess maybe covering the gist of what it is that's being
Sure.
talked about.
Sure. Give me 1 second to pull it up on my I'm going to skip the mechanics portion of it and just kind of focus on the governance and risk portion that was that I highlighted in the forum thread. So I guess the first major, it's not really a decision, but rather an educational topic, is where the DSR even comes from, and how it's created and so forth. So essentially the DSR is, right, when you put DAI into the DSR contract and then you retrieve it, obviously you are taking out more DAI in. So natural question where this additional DAI comes from. The DSR contract has the functionality to essentially just print that DAI and give it to you regardless of any exogenous factors such as collateral or whatnot. And at first glance, this seems concerning, right? Because kind of the main tagline has always been collateral-backed DAI, and this appears to be an instance where DAI is being minted without any collateral being posted against it. But to kind of remedy this little issue, the amount of DSR that is created gets weighted, not weighted, but gets counted against the collected stability fees or the internal surplus of the system, such that if for whatever reason there wasn't enough collected stability fees to pay out the DSR, then the DSR essentially gets recorded as bad debt, right? And so would be subject to a MKR dilution. So the point being that on the technical side of things, DSR is paid for by MKR holders out of the accrued stability fees. So now the question, the questions I pose to the community, which is kind of the discussion that will need to be had probably over several months, to be honest, is what to do about that cost. Should the MKR holders just absorb it, or should they kind of redirect a DSR fee onto the total stability fee for CDP owners, or some hybrid, some blend? And there are a number of economic or business considerations to be had here. So kind of in the naive sense, if you were to just pass on the 100% of the cost to the CDP owner, then you could end up in a situation where certain collateral types, which are depending on generally low stability fees in order to be viable, would immediately get priced out. And so the question is, to what extent do we allow for, I don't know if subsidy is the correct word here, but essentially, do we allow for leeway for certain collateral types, and then either MKR holders pay for it out of this total stability fees collected, or potentially there are options of collateral specific DSR adjustments. So for example, if there's a particular collateral type that is extremely popular and is generating a lot of DAI and is, for whatever reason, contributing to, is proportionally contributing more to a DAI price decline, then would it make sense to add extra stability fee to that collateral type alone, separate from its already calculated risk premium rate? So that's kind of one big question that I pose here. Other questions are, how do we even go about calculating or evaluating these phenomena, in the sense that, will we even be able to kind of assess which collateral types are contributing more or less than than other collateral types towards a particular DAI price decline and stuff like that. You all should give it a read and think about some of these topics and post some thoughts. There's already a bit of a good discussion going on. So I'd like to kind of see that take hold over the next week or so, and then maybe we can revisit. That being said, if no one has any, or looks like there's one question. More of a comment. Okay, yeah, so if anyone has any, no one has any questions, we can move on to the monetary policy aspect. Okay, one question. Alan says, why not start the DSR at 0 and then increase it? Yeah, that's an interesting idea. That was brought up a few other times. So I think one answer to that is, under the current governance cycle that we are proposing, it's typically a 1-month governance cycle. We're not sure with what cadence the DSR adjustments would come in yet. Would they be kind of every week versus the monthly schedule we're planning right now? So we're going to have to kind of decide that from a governance perspective. But that being said, if we could have frequent cadence adjustments, then sure, we could start it at 0, or and then go from there. Maybe start it at some very low safe number as well. But if you have any specific reasons why you think it should start at 0, once again, please post your thoughts in the forum. Another question: how will users hedge DSR exposure if they have a collateral specific DSR? I'm not sure if I understand the question, but interesting nonetheless about how people will go about hedging various exposures. All right, maybe we can talk a little bit more about this at the end of the call. I want to make sure we get through the monetary policy stuff, and then we can circle back for sure. All right, Vishesh, if you are on the line.
Sure. Okay. So I'll just start sharing my screen here. Cool. Hopefully everyone can see everything all right. So just to kind of set the stage, what's been going on in the last week or so, ETH price has been comparatively stable. There's not been that much activity. It did tick up slightly, but more or less pretty stable at the end of the day. That's reflected in what's been going on with collateral. So not much movement in terms of the total amount of collateral locked. Not much added, not much removed, not since basically the end of August. So actually, again, comparatively quiet. So just to touch on the stability fee real quick. So, we saw that there were a few drops to the stability fee over the last couple of weeks. First 18.5, then 16, then 14.5 on September 8th. So what's really interesting is during these first couple of drops, there was actually a dropping DAI supply at the end of the day, which was very odd. But around the 4th, this started to tick up a bit, and then with the 14.5% drop on the 8th, it ticked up a little bit more. So there were, a decent amount of draws. There was a little bit of circulation, some wipes as well, which is particularly interesting. So a slight increase in the DAI supply, a total of a million or a couple million over those few days, which actually basically more or less just balanced out some of the drops just at the end of the month. So all in all, in the 1 month time scale, pretty level. but there was a dip before, and then after the stability fee was increased or decreased, a little bit of a recovery. So interesting to watch this trajectory. It will potentially keep increasing, but it should, but hard to say given that things seem comparatively kind of quiet right now. As far as just some of the long-term activity, what we saw was in collateral terms, basically the evaluation of the community on the amount of risk that they need to manage in their CDPs was, sort of over the beginning of the year, that was pretty significant. Then it had slowed down a bit, and so the amount of locked collateral had started coming down and getting outpaced by the amount of collateral that was being removed. And then, relatively recently, just at beginning of August, the amount being removed started to slow down pretty significantly, and the amount that was being added started recovering again a little bit. So now these are kind of on pace, but in nominal terms, the curves have not been moving that much. And then in terms of debt, so the amount of debt that's been being pulled out had kind of consistently been increasing throughout the history of Maker. And then again, somewhere around mid-end of July, that slowed down a little bit, but then again, so did the amount of collateral that was being wiped. Just the amount that was being wiped was slightly outpacing the amount that had been being drawn, although that trend seems to have slowed down over the last few weeks. So potentially a little bit more of an increase in DAI supply coming, but we'll have to continue to watch that. As far as just long-term relationships between ETH price and what's been going on, so there were some bites over the last month or two. Nothing relatively recently, but that makes sense because ETH price had come down a little bit in mid-end of July. Again, relationship between ETH price and collateral has held pretty steady, pretty solid inverse relationship. I think everyone's pretty familiar with this phenomenon at this point. ETH price had sort of in the longer run been decreasing a bit since July, and so collateral, which was initially dropping due to the nominal drop in ETH price, was sort of recovered and reversing that trend. So again, people perceive that as ETH price drops, there's increased risk, and so they add more collateral. That is a pretty well-known phenomenon at this point, at least in this community. Relationship between debt and ETH price. So actually kind of comparatively not very well related lately, though obviously as the amount of collateralization moves, and I think the likelihood here is that people are sort of controlling or constrained in their capital. And so what happened was, as that price moved and you saw those strong relationships between ETH price and the amount of collateral that was locked or freed, instead, as a lever, people started to manipulate the amount of debt that they had. So basically, as that collateralization ratio fell, one of the more common activities, rather than adding back collateral, was actually to remove some debt, clear it out, refinance it, whatever. And so that's, I think, part of the reason why you saw some of this drop in debt. And that's pretty well explicable by a bit of a decreased demand for leverage, given the way ETH price had been going. But it does seem that there is a little bit of change on the horizon, sort of depends on what ETH does next. So I think it's a little bit of wait and see right now, just kind of watch and see what continues to happen. As far as the DAI peg itself, over the last 24 hours, pretty stable, slightly above $1, very low trading volume, just about 1 million, which is half of what we usually see on like a quiet day. But the price at like, $1.01 roughly. And then if we look at, so yeah, I mean, I think this was.
Vishesh, I have a quick question for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Yep.
I know that a lot of times when we look at the 24-hour DAI volume weighted average price chart, it's usually a lot more, it follows that kind of bell curve distribution, whereas lately in the last day or two, I've noticed that it's been a lot more fragmented and like weird. Do you have an idea about that? Do you think it's
Volume,
a result of lower volume?
Yeah, I mean, lower volume will do that, the prices, I think, follow a better curve when there's stronger volumes, which makes sense. When there's lower volumes, easier to be a victim of slippage, easier to sort of have price impacts from major trades. So just naturally, you do tend to see that sort of spread out a little bit more. So I really do think that's the explanation. It is interesting to see on low volume days. Sorry, I do nerd out a little bit. On low volume days, it is interesting to see some of the like microstructure patterns. So what's cool is you see Kyber here at the like sort of low and high ends of these prices. Coinbase is almost always like dead center. Oasis is generally dead center with maybe a little bit of a wider spread. Uniswap is pretty flat throughout and tends to get pushed up either to a higher end or to a lower end usually. So it's pretty interesting to just watch these microstructures. At some point, someone will write a paper on that. But so to talk about some of the secondary lending platforms and what's been going on there. So I think with some of the changes in the fees and some of the lower supply, it is easier for some of these platforms to like run into a bit of a crunch. So the rates can jump up or drop down a little bit more than they had, say, 3 months ago. And so that's where you start to see some of these spikes and valleys that you can explain around stability fee changes, though that makes sense. What's interesting is with the 14.5% drop, there was actually not a ton of responsiveness you saw in some of those other metrics and in some of these secondary lending metrics. So that's a pretty interesting phenomenon to observe. Additionally, you see in the borrow volumes. So borrow volume was for, just look at DYDX and compound separately, and then we can talk about all together. But for DYDX, that borrow volume had ticked up maybe 20, 30% just in the last, say, 3 weeks, from 6 million to actually up to about 9.5, so a little bit more. Compound, you saw from the end of August, there was a little bit of a jump and then starting to dip down very slightly, about 3 million, which is not a huge percentage change for them, but it is a little bit of a quieting down. And you do see this like sort of couple month long trend of about 27, 26 million. Whereas DYDX was very low around end of July at around 3 million and has basically tripled its borrow volume since then, but nominally smaller numbers on DYDX. So all said and done, the total like secondary lending borrow volume on at least these two platforms around 30 million in end of July and around 34 now. So a slight increase, but overall comparatively pretty level. What's interesting is that increase was primarily happening during a time of a decreasing stability fee. So decreasing stability fee, theoretically having these positions on Maker itself is a bit more attractive. So that's a bit contrary to what you might expect. So we look at supply volumes. The total supply, again, around end of July was around 35 million and now is up to about 48. So that's a pretty significant increase. And that does sort of interestingly correspond to the time of the dropping stability fee as well. But that has been pretty steadily increasing. So I would actually say the interesting part about supply volume on these secondary lending platforms is how little it was correlated to any movement in the stability fee. It just appeared to be a somewhat independent trend. So we look at the excess cash. So if you recall, 2-3 months ago, we were looking at a graph that was decreasing, and so utilization was like significantly increasing during that time. During the same time period, utilization has been significantly decreasing. And again, leveling around this sort of effective floor for these platforms around 70-75%. We generally don't see it go much lower than that because then the rates start responding accordingly. So it seems to be a bit of a natural economic floor, though it's not like a hard-coded floor or anything. So yeah, the excess supply on these secondary lending platforms has come up. So it's it's a very interesting time right now because there's a lower stability fee. There is a bit more excess supply on secondary lending platforms, which, as we've discussed, can often be interpreted to be related to excess supply overall. And given that the actual total maker supply has been pretty steady, decreased a little bit, recovered a little bit, but more or less overall pretty steady, this could be interpreted as a bit of a drop in demand. And so I don't want to FUD, but I would just say keep an eye on this with regards to how much we're dropping that stability fee, because though the DAI price is doing well right now, if there is a sudden bull market, that would be a pretty fluid situation, and you could see these rates and the prices for DAI respond pretty quickly. Though it will be interesting to that would be kind of a third cycle for DAI, so it would be interesting to see what happens in that situation and how resilient it actually is now. Because what we did observe was the second time we went through that situation, DAI was a bit more resilient than it was the first time, and so as we come around again, it will be very interesting to watch. Yeah, and then so just in the longer time scale, 7 days, again, slightly low volumes there, though it has been lower in the last couple days than it was overall for the 7 days. But the price, again, pretty smack dab, similar to the price for the last 24 hours. So this you do, as I mentioned, David, see a little bit more of that curve, primarily because it is that longer time scale. And you do see this bimodal situation going on because basically for a few days there, this was roughly the center, and then for a few days, this was the center. So that's what explains that. It was just a bit of a shift in price. Though, again, within a pretty small band when you really think about things. I'll just switch to the 2 decimal places view. Yeah, so we are talking about a pretty small range of variability in the first place. Okay, so that's the top of the hour. I will pause for any questions and then hand it back to, I guess, Cyrus.
We have a deep discussion about the state of your battery going on in the chat, if you want to.
Yeah, I saw that. Don't worry, y'all. I have chargers.
All right. There was a question from Bartek, though. When you're measuring the Kyber reserve, do you see that one? Is it specifically Kyber only, or is it the Kyber trades that are being forwarded to Oasis?
So it is my understanding that is filtering out for double counting. That's a data set that I get from Lev's group, but yeah, that is filtering out some degree of double counting with regards to Kyber, if that was the concern. It was something someone tweeted about it at some point as well, and we addressed that a while back.
Do you want me to read these out, Vishesh, or can you see them?
I see the USDC DAI. Yeah, so we've sort of gone back and forth on USDC DAI.
Hold on, Vishesh, just 1 second. Since this call, just as a general reminder, since this call is recorded, and also since we do audio versions, it'd be good to really clearly read out the questions. So yeah, just wanted to make sure that the people listening after the fact get a sense of the question.
Yeah, good flag, David. So the question is about incorporating USDC DAI in the metrics. Is there a reason to do it? Is there a reason not to do it? I don't think there's a specific reason not to do it. Is it currently a big part of what I'm looking at? No, this is the DEX ETH to DAI trades at the moment. But I know Lev had talked about potentially including that in his data set, which would make it easy for me to pull. I think it's just an operational thing. There's a limited number of hours and things to work on. And so a lot of that time does go to some, the risk modeling work, but there's no specific reason I would say to not do it that I can think of. Okay, I think those were all the me questions. So I can just hand it back to Cyrus.
All right, let me
Okay,
jump in
cool.
really quick and transition here. So we're at the top of the hour. If people would like to hang around, we'll do a general Q&A for the next 20 or 30 minutes or until interest wanes. For the people that need to bounce, though, thank you to Nik for your presentation. Thank you, Vishesh. Thank you, LongForWisdom. That was a very interesting call. Standard reminders apply. Please join the discussion in the governance forum. Threads have been posted, but it's not hard to find. Forum.makerdao.com. Lots of interesting things happening there. Governance, risk, and now oracles. The new mandate from Nik will be going up soon, so keep your eyes out for that as well. All right, thanks everyone. It was a really good call. Please feel free to hang out for general Q&A. Back to you, Cyrus.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the DSR. So Alan asks, after the DSR, when making changes to DSR stability fees, will both be moved at the same time, or will one be preferred over? That's a really good question, and I don't think we know the answer right now, because we'll have to see how things kind of shake out. But essentially, it depends what kind of behavior you're trying to incentivize. So if we wanted to create more demand for DAI, then we could just raise the DSR without necessarily touching the stability fee, and that would essentially, if you're trying to raise the DAI price, then that should obviously have an effect. The secondary part of that would be, do you then also raise the stability fee to compensate for that extra DSR? And I guess if you did both, then they would both have separate effects on the DAI price. So yeah, I guess we're going to have to learn through the governance community how we want to tinker these parameters. I'm kind of thinking that there's going to be a lot of overshooting and undershooting, and not entirely sure how it's going to shake out through governance, to be honest. Kind of the goal was that stability fees would generally not be too variable. So, oh yeah, right. So one idea that was floated around was that stability fees would only change, and this is just purely hypothetical, but once a month during the standard governance cycle. So every month we can evaluate how has the DSR evolved over the past month and make any necessary stability fee changes. And then the DSR itself could be changed separately through a weekly process. So every week we could have governance for DSR, move it up or down, but then only change the stability fee once a month. So that was one potential idea that was floated around. In terms of preference, I think there is going to be a preference, but I think that's going to probably require some more sophisticated statistical models on the demand and supply of DAI. And I kind of think we'll cross that bridge when we get there, because if we're going to, I think we're all hoping, crossing our fingers for huge expansion in DAI supply over the coming years. It's probably going to just be difficult one way or another to kind of decide what is preferred over the other with our lack of historical data. Any thoughts around a pooled model for DAI locked in DSR with an underlying token that is a claim on the asset pool? That is also an interesting question. The idea of some sort of tokenized version of the DSR. Kind of think that's certainly technically something that's possible. I kind of imagine we'll see some community implementations of that pretty soon after MCD launches, if I had to guess. Yeah, something that I know a lot of people would be looking forward to. Stability fee changing once every 6 months. The question is, or the comment is, should the stability fee be changed once every 6 months? I don't think you can really set any cadence, really. I think the 1 month is just kind of under standard operating procedures, but there could conceivably be times where you need to have mid-month changes for, I don't know, some sort of emergency procedures. I think it's kind of okay to reevaluate or monitor collateral types on a monthly basis. It wouldn't require enormous amount of work, just kind of some checking in on things. I know at some point in the past, I think Rune had floated an idea about doing quarterly evaluations. We'll see. I think in the early days, the more monitoring and updating we can do, the better. Try to keep our foot on the gas as much as possible. Will the DSR stability fee be used to keep the DAI supply growing at a slow pace? I don't know about keeping it at a slow pace, but I think the pace that will keep DAI stable and keep debt ceilings within reasonable limits is probably the way to do it. I think the question should be asking is, at what rate should the global debt ceiling for the entire system be growing?
I had a question, if that's right.
Sure, yeah.
So you mentioned we could potentially increase the DSR without increasing the stability fee.
Right.
So does that affect the risk of the system, right? Because we set the risk premiums based on the risk of the specific collateral.
Yeah,
if we increase the
does.
DSR to eat into that, it screws that, right?
It does in a roundabout way, because right, if the MKR dilution potential is lowered because they're now essentially paying for the DSR, then yeah, basically there is less MKR dilution potential for the rest of the system. Now, I don't think it's going to be a huge deal at a small scale in any sense, but surely if there's a situation where the DSR is like, needs to be like 10%, and then we only want to pass off, like, for whatever reason, 3% of it to the borrowers, then yeah, that's going to create a huge problem for sure. So it has to be within limits, but something that we're aware of.
Thanks.
Another interesting comment that was brought up on the DSR by Fenny, actually one of our in-house counsel, was that if only a small percentage of the total float of DAI is locked up in the DSR, so then you wouldn't have to pass on the full amount to the stability fee. So for example, if the DSR is set to 5%, but only 10% of the DAI supply is locked up in the DSR, then that 5% that is being paid out is only being paid out to that fraction of the total DAI supply, right? And then so then you wouldn't go and assess a 5% DSR fee to the borrowers, because that 5% would be essentially on the total DAI supply. So we'd have to equate the nominal amounts that are being paid out if we were to pass it along. It's kind of an interesting point. I guess David says he made that point months ago. Good for you.
I even made an
I don't
Excel
remember
sheet
that.
calculator and sent it to Rich even before I was hired about
Did
this
you?
exact point. Yes, I did.
Really? Okay, cool. Cool. Good for you.
Yeah, scratching my own itch.
I don't remember that actually, so it's yet to be confirmed. We'll see.
But yeah, it is.
You cut out Cyrus.
I think my internet is dying.
You're back now. Your internet's
Can anyone hear me?
so dead. Yeah,
Okay.
I hear you.
But yeah, it is good to be reminded because this total stability fee, it's not as simple as saying just risk premium plus the DSR fee. So we'll have to do a little bit of extra math there. Question about stress testing the system in such cases described before, I'm assuming about in terms of a MKR dilution potential. Good question. A little bit out of scope for this call right now, but happy to talk about it further in the governance channel.
Okay, I think I see a question from Frank, and he wants to know if the feeds that are providing the prices to the oracles, if they have any requirement to own MKR, or if they have any reasonable motivation to provide valid data. So currently, the incentive for them to have integrity is the fact that they get paid, right? So they're getting paid every month from the Maker Development Fund. The idea is that in the future, governance, when they take over paying the stability fees, would also gain the lever of deciding how much the fees get paid, right? So you can increase or decrease that incentive depending on how risky you want to be. From a technology point of view, we can also aid in kind of risk mitigating here, right? So you mentioned, is there a requirement for them to own MKR? So I think what you're kind of alluding to here is, are they going to stake MKR or should they stake MKR? My opinion on this is yes. Partly because, right, the more you have them stake, right, the more they have to lose, the more integrity they're bound to have. But then we get to, okay, what is the right amount of MKR that they need to stake? And so there's a couple other things that we can do here, right? One thing that's been brought up is, well, if you force someone to stake MKR to get some kind of, compensation stream, don't you also need to kind of increase the compensation based on the opportunity cost of giving up kind of, ownership / control of that MKR? That's something that maybe is more of a question for Cyrus. But yeah, so staking is on the roadmap. Or will be on the roadmap. You guys will get a chance to actually vote on that roadmap to see if you approve. And we'll have a couple other kind of tricks in there to lower that risk and provide more of an incentive for fleets to have integrity.
I have a kind of a question related to kind of my little comment there about stochastic modeling. Isn't stochastic modeling basically stress testing for any like financial risk like stuff generally?
I wouldn't call it stress testing, but I think what you're trying to say is like simulation testing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, not all simulations are for stress testing purposes, but yeah, I see what you're saying.
Okay, cool. Just wanted to like self-check if I'm like somewhat on right about that. Okay.
Hey, Cyrus. Had a question regarding for MCD, the difference between Rep v1 and Rep v2 in terms of the launch collateral for MCD. So how are you thinking about incorporating Rep v1? And if not, or sorry, if so, does it make sense to incorporate Rep v1 and then, you know, over time as the migration process takes place, then kind of deploy for Rep v2?
Right. We were actually just talking about this a couple days ago in their Discord channel. Interestingly enough, I think their community themselves are a little bit kind of pushing for, or kind of suggesting that we hold off and wait for V2 of Rep. And I'm kind of on board with that as well, just merely from the perspective of the overhead required for kind of risk evaluations and governance and everything, and pushing a collateral type through. And to for a fairly short-lived collateral type may not be worth it, because I don't think there would be any like smooth transition where we could just kind of flip from one to the next. And in fact, the game theory and the crypto economics of Rep v2, as I understand it, are significantly different. So it'd have to have a fresh pair of eyes on it anyways. A couple people from the Augur, the Forecast Foundation, have also suggested potentially waiting for V2. But all that being said, if a kind of a collateral application gets filled out from anyone from the community, whomever, gets posted, and MCARE holders, for whatever reason, want it, and they voted up on the priority list, it's certainly we're not in charge of saying what gets in and what doesn't get in. So it can happen.
I think that brings up a really interesting question of how often we should re-poll for the asset priority list.
Right. And in this particular case, we obviously didn't do our own due diligence on this. So I feel like our original asset priority poll was very biased. Not biased, it's just incomplete, right? We should have specified if we were talking about V1 or V2, because I do think that changes things considerably. That being said, we kind of just had this discussion with the Augur community in the last couple of days, so still kind of mulling it over. It's a great point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess just to add on, Rep would be essentially fungible between the V1 and V2, aside from a fork itself, correct? So if MCD were to incorporate Rep V1, and in the event that, you know, there is a fork on V2, then Rep holders would have to migrate. But then you have that 60-day allotment to kind of migrate as well. So you could incorporate V1, and then over time, in the event of a fork, you have enough time to then, you know, migrate over to V2.
So if there's a lot of V1 collateral in MakerDAO, and then that 60-day window starts, what happens in terms of, well, let's see, what happens in terms of the Oracle prices? What happens if you don't switch within 60 days, and have to think about kind of, are there ways for CDP users to somehow game the system? Or actually, we have to think about, are there ways we could unintentionally hurt CDP owners? Are there ways that CDP owners could unintentionally or intentionally hurt MakerDAO? So I think there are at least a few open questions. I don't know if there are simple answers to these. If they are, then sure, it's a possibility. We can surely talk about it as a community. I don't really have too strong of thoughts one way or another.
Got it. Understood. Thanks.
Actually, Nick, what would happen in that case when a token upgrades, and does anything happen from the Oracle side? Because the exchanges will just kind of behind the scenes shift from one to the other, but does the market activity stay fluid? Do they keep trading open? Or I guess if they shut down trading for
there's
period of time, it shouldn't have a
window where they
impact, right?
right. So basically, whenever this right upgrade / fork / whatever occurs, right, there's usually, we're going to be putting this pair in maintenance mode for the next 6 hours, and right when the pair comes back up, right, the order book is basically clear. So from an Oracle standpoint, we would just right, if whatever the exchange thinks rep is, that's what the Oracle is going to source. So that's actually a risk, right? We as a community may have a difference of opinion of which, say rep token is the real rep token, right? So it's not something that we can passively just say, oh, it's not our problem. It's the exchanges, right? Because individual exchanges may have different positions, right? So say Coinbase and Kraken have alternating views on what the real rep token is. We can't just have the oracles keep sourcing prices for both and taking the average, right? So it's something that we have to be actively involved in, kind of first deciding which kind of version of a token that we want to support and when that transition will happen, right? Because it involves kind of having to close. So there's a couple things, right? You either have to force close all existing positions, which you can do by just setting the collateralization ratio super high, right? And then just force liquidating everyone after, giving them a heads up of, say a month beforehand, right? You need to close your position, right? Or an alternative is that, we say as a governance community, well, we'll support both, right? So now you need oracles that are sourcing prices for both, right? But that's really up to you guys.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of bringing on collateral that we know at some point we're going to have to force close people out. That just seems like something we shouldn't want to involve ourselves at this point, especially without any sort of robust, decentralized messaging plan, right? We'd have to spend some time figuring out how we can even get messages out to people.
So Cyrus, let's say that there is Omise Go has a bug in their token contract and they immediately redeploy the token. That is just an externality we're going to have to deal with. It's not something that we can just kind of plan beforehand. Oh, we're never going to take any shitty collateral that could possibly lead to the circumstance.
I mean, if if Omise Go has a bug in their token, you think that MakerDAO should just force close everybody's positions on the spot?
I mean,
it's an interesting question for sure. We should have some plans for these kinds of.
There's different scenarios. There's a planned kind
eventually, I think we need to start. We might mitigate them.
We did not hear anything of what you just said.
Cyrus, if you turn your video off, you'll be able to probably speak better on lower bandwidth.
Sorry.
Or not.
It didn't work.
So maybe I can just chime in for a second, right? We'll have different processes in place depending on the scenario, right? So there's a big difference between, I don't want to keep picking on these guys, but you know, Omisigo finding a bug in their token contract and immediately, you know, deploying a new one, right? And a kind of planned migration, right? Where say Augur thinks, hey, we need to expand the capabilities of our token, and so we're going to do a planned token upgrade, right, on this date 1 month from now, right? So how we handle those two scenarios is probably very, very different. But I would implore the community to look at these primarily from a risk perspective, right? If you have to, you know, force close everyone's position because it presents some kind of existential risk to the system, then it doesn't matter that the optics of force closing are bad. You have to. But that's at least my position on this.
Hard to disagree with that, really.
Yeah, there's. We should point out that there's some dramatic proclamations being made, and none of that is written in stone. So there's going to be lots of conversations about how to manage risk in edge cases in the future. We don't know what it looks like for a token to get compromised en masse yet. We are going to find out what that looks like. I guarantee it. But and I'm not the risk analyst, I'm not a system architect, but I am aware that there's 4 or 5 different things we can do in those situations off the top of my head, like set the debt ceiling to 0, you set the stability high, you liquidate people, you allow them to redeem, you just immediately transfer their whatever existing collateral for ETH and then call it a day on that thing, or you liquidate them and you make them accept the penalty. So there's all kinds of things we can do. It'll be fun to figure out exactly how that happens, though. We're at half hour after the call, and I have other engagements, so I can no longer stick around. I'm not sure whether Cyrus is going to make it back or not. What do people think? If there are more questions to be asked, I can hand the hosting off to somebody else, or should we stick a fork in it and continue this next week?
I think we've covered a lot. I think it's probably good we stick a fork in it. We usually do it an hour and a half anyway.
We do usually do it an hour and a half. All right, so thanks everybody for joining. Lots of great calls. I've learned a lesson that if we put up with at least 35 seconds of uncomfortable silence, somebody will continue to answer questions. So we'll use that as a plan in the future, and I won't end these calls so quickly. All right, thanks everybody. Talk to you next week. Look for forum thread. Look for YouTube, look for SoundClouds, and follow me on Twitter, like, subscribe, and whatever else. All right, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.